Welcome to The Unstressed Exec, the podcast where we dive deep into the real conversations that help you lead, love, and live with greater clarity, courage, and calm. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, executive coach and clinical forensic psychologist, and I help high-achieving professionals navigate life transitions, resolve conflict with confidence, and build unshakable psychological resilience. So if you're ready to lead with purpose, master conflict with grace, and become more emotionally agile under pressure, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Welcome back to The Unstressed Exec, where we talk about how to perform, lead, and live with clarity, calm, and confidence, even when life feels like it's coming apart at the seams. I'm your host, Dr. George Vergolias, forensic psychologist, executive and resilience coach, and someone who has spent decades working at the intersection of human behavior, high-stakes decision-making, and real-world pressure in relationships, in leadership, and in life. Before we dive in, a quick reminder. If these conversations resonate with you and you want physical, practical tools to apply what you're learning, check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a no-bullshit, clinically grounded guide designed to help you spot manipulation early, regulate your responses, and protect your clarity in high conflict situations. You can find it on Amazon, and I'll link it in the show notes. So today's topic. Today we're talking about one of the most psychologically loaded actions a person can take, and that is walking away. This episode is titled Walking Away Without Guilt, Emotional Detachment Without Becoming Cold. And I want to start with something that doesn't get said enough. For most people, living isn't actually the hardest part. Staying gone is the hardest part. Start with something that doesn't get said enough. For most people, leaving isn't actually the hardest part. Staying gone is. Because the moment you create distance, whether that's from a toxic relationship, a manipulative boss, a family member who drains you, or a business partnership that was slowly killing your spirit, the guilt shows up. The doubt creeps in. The second guessing starts. And your brain starts firing questions at you like, am I being selfish? Did I try hard enough? What if they change? Am I abandoning them? What will people think? So today we're going to unpack why walking away feels morally wrong, even when it's psychologically necessary. We're going to go deep on the neuroscience of guilt and detachment. We're going to talk about why closure is largely a myth and what actually works instead. And I'm going to give you a clear, practical framework for how to walk away and stay away without shutting down your heart, without becoming guarded, and without losing yourself in the process. This applies whether we're talking about a romantic relationship, a friendship, a family system that you're dealing with, a workplace, or a professional environment that was slowly eroding your well-being. So we have to start by first asking why walking away feels like failure. And it's a good place to start because this is where most people get stuck. Most of us were raised with a very specific set of beliefs about loyalty, commitment, endurance. And it's kind of like a software loop that we've been programmed into, and we continue to play it out as we become adults. And that may sound something like this. You don't quit. You work things out. You forgive and you stay. You endure the hard reasons. Loyalty means you don't walk. And the difficulty with that is, I'd say that all of us have examples of that elderly couple that has been married for 50 or 60 years. And everyone talks about, God, that's so amazing. They've stayed together so long. And what we were reflecting on, there's a lot of positives to that, of course, but it almost seems like we are rewarding marriage as an endurance sport. And it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be an endurance sport. Marriage or any long-term relationship really needs to be based on mutual respect and connectedness and joy. And here's the thing, in healthy relationships, those values are exactly right. They're the foundation of resilience, of long-term connection, of mature love, and solid professional partnerships. But in toxic dynamics, those same values become weapons that are used against you. When you've been conditioned to believe that persistence is virtue, walking away doesn't feel like self protection. It feels like moral failure. It feels like you broke your own code. And that's by design, by the way. One of the most consistent things I've observed across 2 decades of clinical and forensic practice, as well as my coaching work, is that toxic individuals and toxic systems are very good at using your values against you. They know that if you're a loyal person, they can trigger your guilt by framing your departure as betrayal. They know that if you're a compassionate person, they can keep you tethered by playing the victim. And they know that if you're a fixer, they can keep you engaged indefinitely by dangling the promise of change. So let me offer a reframe that I use with my clients regularly. Perseverance in dysfunction is not strength. It's actually self-abandonment. Staying in something that is slowly destroying your clarity, your health, your confidence, or your sense of self, that's not noble. That's not loyalty. That's erosion. It's critical to understand that. Walking away when it's the right move, it's not quitting, it's choosing. It's choosing a different you, it's choosing a different pattern, it's choosing a different life. And that distinction matters enormously. So, to understand that better, we have to understand the neuroscience of guilt with your brain and why your brain punishes you for choosing itself. Now, let's go a little deeper because I want you to understand what's actually happening in your brain when you try to walk away and guilt floods in. Guilt is not a character flaw, it's a social emotion. And it evolved for a specific reason to preserve group cohesion. From an evolutionary standpoint, humans needed that group to survive. If you were cast out, if you were rejected, being seen as someone who breaks the social contract, that essentially was death. It was a death sentence for most of human history. So your brain evolved to punish you when it perceives that you violated a relational norm. The anterior cingulate cortex lights up. Your insula activates. You experience something that feels like moral pain, and neurologically, it actually overlaps with physical pain because it used to mean survival or death. Now, layer on top of that the role of oxytocin and attachment. Oxytocin, which is often called the bonding hormone, is released in close relationships. It deepens attachment, it creates a sense of safety and warmth with specific people, and it makes separation feel genuinely painful. It actually is heightened for women that are pregnant, especially as they're getting near childbirth. And this is why leaving someone who is also hurtful can still feel devastating. Your nervous system built a bond, and severing that bond triggers a withdrawal-like response that is neurobiologically real. This gets weaponized through intermittent reinforcement. Think about it. Cycles of punishment and reward that keep you hooked at a neurological level. The unpredictability of a toxic relationship actually increases dopamine sensitivity, which means that high levels get higher and the pull to return is stronger. You need more to feel safe again. You need more to feel like you're back to a certain degree of homeostasis. It very much is like an addictive drug. And this is the same mechanism that drives things like gambling addiction. It's not weakness, it's basic neurochemistry. So when you walk away and feel an overwhelming urge to go back, to explain yourself one more time, to check whether they've changed, to respond to the Hoover text that they've sent you, right? That is your nervous system trying to complete a cycle it was trained to repeat. Understanding this doesn't make it easier immediately, but it does reframe the guilt from a moral verdict to a neurological event. And that matters because you can work with a neurological event. You can regulate it. You can interpret it. You can become aware of it. And in a way, you can redirect it and short circuit it. So the takeaway here is that you're not messed up. You're not wrong. You're not inadequate. Your brain is just firing in a particular way that you need to retrain. Here's the critical distinction I want you to hold on to. Guilt is appropriate when you violate your values. Guilt is not appropriate when you enforce them. If someone experiences your boundary as harm, if they experience your departure as abandonment, that does not automatically make you the wrong one. Their reaction is data about them. It is not a verdict about you. It's critical to know that because people will gaslight you and they will try to redirect it back on you. And this is especially important in professional contexts. If you leave a toxic workplace, a manipulative leader, or a dysfunctional team, and people respond with anger or guilt tripping, understand that that reaction is often a system trying to preserve itself. It's not evidence that you made a mistake. And it's certainly not evidence that anything is wrong with you. So let's talk a little bit about detachment versus coldness and the critical importance of knowing the difference. One of the most common fears I hear from people who are trying to disengage from something toxic is this: I don't want to become cold. I don't want to lose my ability to feel or to connect or to care. And that fear is legitimate because some people do become cold after enough pain. They build up a wall, they build up armor that guards them from future pain, but it also distances them and blocks them from really engaging in intimate, real connections with others. They don't just detach from one toxic situation, they detach from everything. They build walls so high that no one gets through, not even the people who deserve it. I'm currently reflecting on Pink Floyd's album and eventual rock opera, The Wall, which is an amazing musical piece. If you haven't checked it out, please do. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but it really describes a history of disconnect and trauma that leads to young people at that particular time in England from building an emotional and social wall against those that have abandoned them, invalidated them, or harmed them in some way. In this context for today, though, but I want to be very clear on one thing is the outcome is not inevitable. And it's not what healthy detachment actually looks like. Emotional detachment, real healthy detachment, it's not apathy, it's not cruelty, it's not even indifference, and it's certainly not shutting your heart down. What it is at its core is this: making the statement, I no longer allow your behavior to dictate my emotional stability. That's it. That's the whole thing. You can care about someone and still remove their access to you. You can wish them well genuinely and still walk away. You can understand someone's wounds and still protect yourself from them when you need to. And you can have compassion for a colleague's stress while still refusing to absorb their chaos. Detachment is not the absence of feeling, it's the refusal to be consumed by the other person's drama. Think about it this way. From a neuroscience perspective, we talk about the difference between empathy and compassion. Empathy is feeling what someone else feels. Compassion is caring about someone without merging with their emotional state. There's a difference there, and it's important to recognize it. Research that has been put out by Tanya Singler's lab at the Max Planck Institute showed that pure empathy without healthy boundaries is actually associated with burnout, compassion fatigue, and emotional dysregulation. Compassion, on the other hand, caring from a grounded, separate place, is associated with pro-social behavior, well-being, and resilience. Healthy detachment is the relational equivalent of compassion over empathy. You can care, you just don't merge. And that's critical. And the other thing to be mindful of is you might be thinking, well, attaching and detaching, that only happens every now and then with like really big dramatic relationships. Bullshit. We attach and detach as sentient human beings our entire lifespan. We go to schools, we leave schools. We move into towns, we move away from towns. We start jobs, we leave jobs. We get into friendships and romantic relationships, and then we leave those. We make certain friends who get closer and then they drift away. All, all throughout the lifespan. People are born and people die. We are constantly attaching and detaching. And in professional settings, this is actually a core leadership competency. The most effective leaders I've worked with, C-suite executives, senior partners, founders, entrepreneurs, they're not emotionally cold, but they have developed the capacity to remain regulated when others around them are dysregulated. They remain calm in the storm. That is detachment in its healthiest form. I want to offer you a case study. It's what I call the guilt loop. So this case is drawn from patterns I've seen across multiple clients. So it's kind of a composite case with details that are changed to protect confidentiality, of course. This is a client that I'm going to call Marcus. Marcus was a senior director at a mid-sized firm. By every external measure, he was successful. He was respected, competent, known as someone who could handle pressure. But he'd spent 5 years working directly under a CEO who was, by every definition, a high conflict personality with strong narcissistic features. The CEO was brilliant, charismatic, and absolutely relentless in his ability to shift blame, rewrite history, and make Marcus doubt his own read of situations. On good weeks, Marcus felt like a valued partner, but on bad weeks, he was publicly undermined in leadership meetings and had his ideas credited to others, and was told repeatedly that his instincts were wrong. Marcus finally made the decision to leave. It's a new role, better organization, significantly better leadership culture. It was the right move by every objective measure. And then the guilt hit. Every few days, the loop would start. What if I overreacted? What if this new place is worse? He was under a lot of pressure back then. Maybe I should have been more patient. The team is going to struggle without me. What if they actually needed me? And on the personal side, Marcus also had recently ended a long-term relationship with a partner who, it turned out, had many of those same dynamics. The intermittent warmth, the emotional volatility, the subtle erosion of his confidence over time. 2 exits, double the guilt, double the second guessing. When we worked through this in coaching and worked through it together, what we found was this: the guilt wasn't really about harming the CEO or the partner. When Marcus got honest with himself, he didn't think either of them was genuinely devastated by his departure. They had both moved on with remarkable speed. The guilt was about breaking a role. It was breaking an image that he built for himself. He had built his entire identity around being the reliable one, the one who stayed, the one who could handle it, the one who made dysfunctional systems functional through sheer competence and endurance. So walking away didn't just mean leaving those situations, it meant dismantling an identity. An identity disruption, even when the identity was unhealthy, activates the same neurological threat response as physical danger. The brain doesn't always distinguish between I am being attacked versus I don't know who I am anymore. Once Marcus could see that clearly, once he understood that the guilt was not about an identity he was grieving, once Marcus could see that clearly, once he understood that the guilt was about an identity he was grieving, not a harm he had caused, that grip loosened. He didn't stop caring. He didn't become cold. He just stopped performing a role that was destroying him. And that's the shift that's needed. So one thing that comes up in this context is closure. And I'd be remiss not to comment on why closure is largely a myth and really what actually works instead. And this is the section that I really want to expand on, because I think the concept of closure is one of the most pervasive and damaging myths in modern psychology. And I say that as a psychologist and an executive coach. The idea of closure is seductive. It promises that if you can just have the right conversation, the one where they finally understand, where they admit what they did, where there's a mutual dignified ending, then you'll be able to move on cleanly. You'll feel complete. The chapter will actually close. And it almost never works out that way. It's utter bullshit. And here's why. And I want to be direct about the psychology behind it. First, closure seeking is often protest behavior. Let me unpack this. Attachment research, particularly work building on John Bowlby's foundational theory and later extended by researchers like Phil Shaver and Mariel Mulkensinner, identifies something called protest behavior. When attachment bonds are disrupted, the nervous system doesn't immediately accept the loss. It protests. It tries to restore the connection. It wants to get back to its default mode. It wants to get back to homeostasis. It keeps seeking contact, explanation, resolution, not because resolution is actually available, but because the nervous system hasn't yet accepted that the bond is gone. It's their way of re-engaging Or if you are doing this, it's your way of re-engaging. Garrison Keillor has a great quote that he's said many years ago. That's what you do when you're angry with someone. You keep them a part of your life. We like to think that when we are angry or dysregulated by someone's behavior, they treated us wrong, they traumatized us, they broke up with us, they moved on. We like to think that the anger we have towards them is actually a healthy move forward. And it can be healthy initially because it could activate energy that we need to keep going in our life. But at some point, we hang on to that anger because it's the one thing we remain that keeps us connected to them. It's like a security blanket, but one that smells and is dirty and is not good for us. But we're hanging on to it because it's the only security blanket we know. And this is the same thing with protest behavior. The conversation you keep rehearsing in your head at 2 a.m., that's protest behavior. The text you draft and then delete 17 times, protest behavior. The urge to reach out just to get clarity. Protest behavior feels like a rational need for closure. It is actually a nervous system trying to restore an attachment. But the problem is that acting on it almost never provides what it promises. Second, toxic people cannot provide the closure you need. That's the funny thing. And when we really get over these things and we look back with the sense of why the hell did I think that person was going to give me something? Integrity, honesty, transparency that they never gave me with months or years in a relationship with them. Why did I think suddenly at the end they were going to do that? So let me be blunt here. If you're dealing with a high conflict personality, someone with narcissistic or borderline or manipulative patterns, the closure conversation will not give you what you're looking for. Because what you're looking for is acknowledgement, understanding, accountability. You're looking for some version of, I see what I did, I understand how it affected you, I'm sorry. That's not going to happen. And people with these patterns are structurally unable to provide that. You're asking a cat to bark. You're asking a dog to meow. It's just not going to happen in most cases. And it's not because they're evil, but because their psychological architecture doesn't work that way. Accountability requires a stable sense of self that can withstand the threat of being wrong. And when somebody has a narcissistic injury, the deep-seated shame at the core of many of these personalities, it makes genuine accountability feel existentially threatening. It's not just, they have trouble admitting they're wrong. No, it is an existential threat to their sense of self to admit they are wrong. So instead of accountability, what do you get? You get deflection, minimization, DARVO, which is deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. Or temporary admission that evaporates the moment they feel safe again. You walk away from that conversation feeling worse than when you started, because now you have confirmation that they won't change, but your nervous system experienced the interaction as another attachment disruption. So more activation for you and more pain without the resolution that you were falsely promised. Third, the final conversation often reopens the door. It does not close the door. Here's the clinical reality that most people don't talk about. And frankly, your therapist probably isn't going to tell you. The closure conversation, especially with someone who is manipulative or high conflict, is frequently the mechanism through which people get pulled back in. You go in clear, you go in boundaried, you go in with every intention of this being the last conversation, and then they soften, or they cry, or they say something that sounds like insight or growth, or they threaten, or they reignite the old dynamic in some way that your nervous system recognizes. And before you know it, you're 6 months further into something you had tried to leave. The search for closure is often the thing that prevents it. So what actually works? Real closure is an internal process. It's within you. It's not in the other person. You have to stop outsourcing closure. That's what I love to tell my coaching clients. Stop outsourcing closure. It doesn't come from them. It comes from within you. It comes from acceptance. And acceptance is not the same as approval. You're not saying what happened was okay. You're not saying they were right. You're not saying you didn't deserve better. Acceptance means I cannot change what happened. I cannot make this person understand me, even if I deserve to be understood. I cannot explain them into accountability. I cannot fix something that the other person doesn't want fixed. And I can't still move forward fully and intentionally without their participation. And I can still move forward fully and intentionally without their participation. Psychologist and grief researcher George Bonanno has documented extensively that human beings are extraordinarily resilient after loss. It's actually the normative response to trauma as well. We think grief or loss or trauma means someone's going to be kind of pulled down by the trauma. The normative response to these things is the body absorbs the blow. People move on. They have a period of adjustment, but they take the hit. They absorb the blow and they get back to some semblance of meaning in their life. That's actually the normative response. But the path through is not resolution in the sense of everything being made right. It's integration. You take the experience, you take the hit, you metabolize it, and incorporating it into your understanding of yourself and the world without being defined or consumed by it. That's the healthy response to loss and trauma. In practical terms, this means the closure work begins in your own nervous system. And it happens in your own nervous system through therapy, through journaling, through movement, through coaching, through honest conversation with safe people. Not through one more conversation with the person who hurt you and the person who has not been willing to change for 3 years, and you suddenly expect them to change for one conversation. When you take a step back and think of it that way, you know it's utter bullshit. Walking away without closure is not unfinished business. It is sometimes the most complete thing you can do. So, what is a 5-step framework? I want to give you something that is practical, take and use that you can walk away from this episode with. It's a 5-step framework for walking away without losing yourself. So, let's get practical because insight without a pathway is just interesting conversation. And I want you to leave today with something you can really use. Here's my 5-step framework for how you do walk away without guilt, without coldness, and without losing yourself. Step 1, name the role, not just the relationship. Before you can fully disengage, you need to understand what you were performing in that dynamic. What part were you playing? Not just who the other person was, but who you were in the relation to them. Were you the rescuer, the stabilizer, the one who kept the peace, the one who made the dysfunction functional, the one who absorbed the chaos so everyone else could operate? In professional settings, were you the person who stayed late to clean up someone else's mess? The one who softened the CEO's edges for the rest of the team, who ran interference? The one who sacrificed your own capacity to protect the organization? So name the role. Because when you leave, you're not just leaving a person or a job, you're leaving an identity. And your nervous system will grieve that identity even if it was killing you. Naming it gives you something concrete to work with, rather than a vague sense of loss that keeps pulling you back. Additionally, when you name it, you're no longer in the dynamic, you're observing the dynamic. So now you're half a step or even full step out of it, observing it. That gives us more power and control. Step 2, separate guilt from grief. Not everything that feels like guilt is guilt. Some of it is grief, and they require very different responses. They require discernment. Guilt says, I did something wrong. It points at behavior. It asks for repair or correction. It even demands it. How do I right this wrong that I did? Grief says something entirely different. It says something that mattered to me is gone. It points at loss. It asks for time, space, processing. Many people stay stuck in the guilt loop because they're misunderstanding grief as guilt. They think that they need to go back and fix something. What they actually need is to grieve something. The relationship they wished it could have been, the version of themselves that believed it would get better, the future they had imagined. When the emotional pain hits, ask yourself, is this guilt about something I actually did wrong? Or is this grief about something I've lost? You need to build discernment around this. That distinction changes everything about how you respond. Step 3, let go of the narrative. One of the most draining aspects of walking away from a toxic situation is the mental energy spent managing the story. Who knows? What do they think happened? What are they saying about me? What's the official version once I leave? Here's the part no one talks about. When you walk away, some people will misinterpret your departure. They'll call you cold, selfish, a quitter, disloyal, incompetent, whatever. And in professional settings, the narrative can get even more pointed. I have worked for a company where every time somebody left over the course of years, we never looked at the mirror and said, boy, how did we really lose this great person? It was always sour grapes. Oh, they weren't a good fit. They couldn't keep up anymore. They were getting jaded. They were incompetent. It was always this sense of interpreting it as they were the problem. And for a long time, we continued to lose talent. So the ability to look at that is critical. And you have to be willing to tolerate being misunderstood if you're the person walking away without correcting it. That is one of the hardest things I ask of my coaching clients. And I want to be honest about that. The urge to correct the record, to make sure people know your side, to ensure that the narrative reflects reality. That urge is deeply human. But in high conflict situations, engaging with the narrative almost always extends the conflict. It gives the other person continued access to your emotional energy, and it keeps you tethered to something you were trying to leave. Letting go of the narrative is an act of profound self-trust. It means, essentially, that believing that your own clarity about what happened matters more than convincing anyone else. Step 4, narrow access and don't close your heart. And I really like this because it really is at some point, it is about the heart. Yes, there's a lot of analytical stuff in this episode. And yes, you need to analyze this and be insightful and think this through and have awareness. But there's a heart piece to this as well. And this is the key to detachment without coldness. And it's a distinction I want you really to sit with. You don't have to become a different person. You don't have to stop being warm or generous or loyal or open-hearted. Those are your strengths. Those are your superpowers, and they're worth protecting. What you do, though, is you narrow access. Not everyone gets the full version of you. Not everyone has earned the level of access that requires your trust. You don't generalize one person's betrayal to everyone. You observe. You pace. You develop cadence. You develop proportionality. You let trust build incrementally through demonstrated behavior over time. And this is critical for those of you right now listening. I know a lot of my content is about divorce and moving on and separation and moving on to second chances and kind of refinding yourself after divorce. It is critical here, what I just said. You build trust incrementally through demonstrated behavior over time. And I see so many people come to me and they're struggling because they're just so jaded. They're so cut off. And they think that's the way to protect. It isn't. It's the way to build a prison around yourself with a key that locks from the inside. So in practical terms, you're not building walls. You're building gates. Walls keep everything out and everybody out. Gates open for the right people at the right time with the right evidence. The clinical literature on post-traumatic growth, research by Tedeschi and Calhoun, among others, and as well as George Bonanno, who I mentioned earlier, consistently shows that people who recover most fully from relational trauma are not the ones who shut down. They're the ones who develop what I call selective openness, the ability to remain warm and connected generally while being discerning and boundaried with specific people or in specific situations. They know when to use it and open up and when not to use it or to shut it down. Your capacity to connect is not the problem. Your targeting is. Fine-tune the targeting. Don't scrap the capacity. Step 5, build a new anchor. The final step in this 5-step model And the one that sustains everything else is this: you need something to walk toward, not just something to walk away from. Again, so often I see people come to me and they're in pain and they're going through divorce or separation or relationship transition, and they're just so consumed with the anger and the pain. And by doing that, they're keeping the ex psychologically so close to them because they're focusing on what they're walking away from. And they're not focusing enough on what they're walking towards, the life they want to build. And that's a big part of the coaching that I do. And I do it in my therapy as well. One of the reasons people return to toxic situations after relationships, after toxic workplaces, after dysfunctional family dynamics is that they didn't build a compelling enough alternative. The pain of the familiar will always beat the uncertainty of the unknown. The nervous system chooses the familiar threat over the unfamiliar calm. A new anchor can be a values clarification, getting explicit about who you want to be and what kind of relationships and environments you want to build. It can be a physical practice that regulates your nervous system. It can be a professional community, a creative pursuit, a coaching relationship, a therapeutic process. Could be any of these. What it needs to do is give your brain a new reference point, a new North Star that is more compelling than the pullback to what was familiar before. Walking away is the beginning, not the end. The work is in the building the life you walked toward, not just emphasizing and focusing on what you're leaving. So as you think of this, and we put this into the larger context of detachment that I talked about earlier, it begs the question of, okay, where does this lead? And where it leads to a place where detachment becomes freedom. There is a great line by Jocko Willink, who's an ex-Navy SEAL who does a lot of leadership consulting and training on just leadership and the powers of leadership. And he has a great book from a number of years ago called Extreme Ownership. And in it, he has this concept where he says, discipline sets you free. And often when we think of discipline, think of the most disciplined person in your orbit. The person that gets up at 5 every morning and works out consistently every day and just sticks to their schedule. And it's easy to look at them and say, man, they're a slave to their schedule. Yes, they're disciplined, but they're a slave to their schedule. They're actually not. That discipline allows them to have tremendous amounts of freedom in other areas because they had the discipline to focus in on what they needed to focus in on when they needed to focus in on it. It's those of us, and I will say I struggle with discipline. I have ADHD. Those of you that have been listening to this podcast know that. And I struggle with consistent discipline over time. I've learned to rope it in. I've learned to structure it in a way that it works for me. But there's times I do struggle. And when I do struggle during those weeks, I actually lack freedom because I'm behind the ball. I'm out of sorts. I'm not keeping up. And so when the weekend comes, I'm busy playing catch up because I didn't have the discipline to do certain things. So I want to close the content section of today's episode with something that I think is important to name because many people don't recognize it when it arrives. There is a moment when detachment shifts from something you're working on to something you've actually arrived at. And it doesn't always announce itself dramatically. It just shows up sometimes, and it shows up quietly. And you know when you've gotten there from that place where you're working on it till you've arrived, you know you've gotten there when you stop rehearsing arguments in your head and that loop goes quiet. You know you achieved it when you stop needing them to see your side. Their understanding is no longer required for your peace or your ability to move on. You stop checking whether they've changed. It simply stops mattering. You stop explaining yourself to people who already decided that you're wrong and you're going to be wrong. You encounter something that reminds you of them, a song, a situation, a type of person, a car that reminds you of their car, and it doesn't hijack your entire day. And in professional settings, you stop monitoring their behavior, their performance, their narrative about you, and you start focusing much more on you, what you can control and what you can do, and what you can influence. I like to phrase it this way to my clients. Think of the last time you were in a relationship that was tough. Maybe even the person broke up with you or left you if it was a marriage. And when did you know you were really over them? And I get 8 out of 10 times I get a variation of this. It's when I heard about their life. They found somebody, they got remarried, they lost 20 pounds, they got a new job, they bought a new house. I heard about their life and I was agnostic. I didn't give a shit either way. I wasn't really happy for him, but I wasn't unhappy for him. It just didn't matter. That's when you know you got there. That's when you know you are at a healthy level of detachment. Because it's not bitterness and it's not coldness. It is clarity. And clarity is the whole point of everything we talked about on this show, and in particular on this episode. Detachment becomes freedom when you stop needing the situation to have been different in order for you to feel okay. You can acknowledge that something was hard, that it cost you something real, that you deserved better, and you can still be fully present, fully functional, and fully forward moving in the present moment. And that balance between acknowledging the wound and refusing to be defined by it is where real strength lives. Walking away without guilt doesn't mean you don't care. It means you care about your own stability, your own clarity, and your own future more than you care about someone else's approval of your departure. It means you understand that not every relationship, personal or professional, is meant to be fixed. Some are meant to teach, some are meant to reveal, and some are simply meant to end, to walk the fuck away from. And that's just life. You can detach without becoming cold, and you can leave without becoming cruel. You can protect yourself without becoming hardened. And you can walk forward without carrying the weight of someone else's unresolved chaos and bullshit. And none of that is abandonment. That, my friends, is freedom. Okay. If today's episode resonated and you're ready to continue this work, I invite you to check out my workbook, The Conflict Whisperer, From Conflict to Clarity. It's a practical, no bullshit guide to rebuilding self-trust, strengthening boundaries, and navigating relationships with clarity instead of fear. It's available now on Amazon, and I'll drop a link in the show notes. And remember, insight without action changes nothing. If you're ready to turn healing into momentum and clarity into confidence, coaching can be the catalyst. Coaching will change you. You can find me at www.theunstressedexec.com or on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube as The Unstressed Exec. Until next time, I'm Dr. George Vergolias. Thanks for listening. And remember, shift happens.